to the supplementary video for Chapter 5, Constitutive Approaches to Organizational Communication. A reminder to look through this list so you know what you need to cover in this chapter. In the previous chapters, we've looked at several metaphors to explain how people have understood organizations over the last century, from machines and families to systems and cultures. What all these metaphors have in common is a conceptualization of the organization as a container within which communication occurs. Communication processes may differ greatly within various containers, but for all these approaches, the organization is seen as a thing that holds communication processes and that influences the nature of those communication processes. But recently, this idea of a container metaphor has come under critique. After all, what exactly is this thing, the organization, that supposedly contains communication? If organizations are separate things that somehow contain communication, then what exactly is the nature of organization in the first place? How is it possible that an organization can exist separately from communication? Don't organizations really exist as communication? We know that organizations aren't simply buildings or organizational charts. They are the social collectives that exist as certain people interact with other people in certain ways over extended periods of time. This certainly complicates the idea that organizations are some sort of container that holds communication. And this is what we want to explore further in this chapter. Communication scholars have been on the cutting edge of new advances in organizational studies, developing what we call a constitutive approach to organizational communication. The idea that communication constitutes organization, and we use the acronym CCO for short, Communicative Constitution of Organizations. This relates to the more complicated approach to communication we discussed in Chapter 1, based on the notion of social construction. For example, a CCO approach questions the idea that bureaucracy simply exists independently, and then communication is something that flows within the container of a bureaucracy. Instead, a CCO approach would say that the concept of bureaucracy itself is communicatively constituted. It exists as communication, as people repeatedly interact with each other in certain ways. This repeated communication behavior recreates and sustains the bureaucracy. But if people stopped interacting in these ways, the bureaucracy would simply cease to exist. I developed this idea in much more depth in that animated video called What is Organizational Communication? We looked at back in week 1. Definitely a good idea to go back and watch that video or read the transcript if you need more clarity about a constitutive approach to organizational communication. But for our purposes in this chapter, we're going to look at two conceptual foundations that support a constitutive approach to organizational communication: structuration theory and discourse theory. And then we'll cover the two main applications or schools of thought for CCO scholarship: the Montreal School and the Four Flows School. First, the CCO approach is informed by two important theoretical foundations. Structuration is a sociological theory that tries to explain the relationship between human action, what scholars call agency, and social structures, the enduring frameworks of social life. Research demonstrates that human agency creates social structures, and those social structures then impose themselves back upon subsequent human action, which in turn reshapes the social structures, so on and so forth, a process scholars call structuration. Think of something like marriage. Marriage is a social structure. It's not part of the natural world like mountains or rivers that exist apart from human action. It's created by human agency. Your actions with a romantic partner can create a marriage. But once created, that social structure of a marriage has power to impose itself back up down upon you and shape your behavior, even though you are the ones who created the structure in the first place. And your subsequent actions will reshape what your marriage is, what the social structure is, which in turn will shape your future interactions and so on. Hopefully you can see how this thinking would translate to the world of organizational communication, since organizations are social structures and communication is the most prevalent form of human agency or action. Additionally, CCO thinking is informed by the concept of discourse, both in terms of day-to-day ways of talking, what scholars call little d discourse, but also enduring systems of thought, what scholars call big D discourse. For example, if you're in the Greek system, like in a sorority or fraternity, or friends with someone who is, You know that these students have a different way of talking that's just, well, different from other students. They have a different vocabulary, a different set of norms and values, and a different way of interacting on campus. They have a unique discourse with a little d. But Greek life also involves an enduring way of thinking about college, relationships, service, and socializing that transcends any one particular member or chapter. There is a big D discourse about Greek life that persists across space and time. Hopefully you can see how this thinking about discourse would apply to organizational communication. Organization consists of lots of little d discourse, but also they are embedded in bigger discourses, big D, related to their industries or sectors. Take Apple computers, for example. There's a particular way of talking and interacting that is unique to Apple, that would be different than working for different organizations. The little d discourse of Apple. But Apple is also part of a larger technology industry shaped by bigger D discourses of creativity and innovation and global competition. From these theoretical foundations of structuration and discourse, two schools of thought have emerged as the main applications of CCO thinking. First is the Montreal School of Organizational Communication, named for the University of Montreal, where there are several leading organizational communication scholars who have developed a particular approach to CCO thinking. Their ideas can get pretty complicated. After all, this is the cutting edge of organizational communication scholarship. But there are some key aspects of Montreal School CCO thinking that are useful for our focus in this introductory class. First is the idea of co-orientation, the process through which people coordinate activity through interaction. Co-orientation is achieved through an ongoing loop of conversations and texts. Conversations are the interactions among people facilitated by language, whereas texts are the tangible substance or outcomes of conversations, like memos, reports, or a mission statement. Conversations influence texts, which shape subsequent conversations. Hopefully you notice the connection to structuration theory here. And organizations are constituted through the ongoing process of co-orientation, where the continual text-conversation feedback loops scale up to recognizable social forms we call organizations. And this scaling up happens as the textual outcomes of conversations gain distance from their original circumstances, a process Montreal School scholars call distantiation. For example, take a group of friends helping somebody move. That doesn't constitute a moving company. However, if those same friends continued to have conversations about helping other people move, charging money for their services and purchasing moving equipment, and if these conversations became textualized into various policies, procedures, rules of operations, and articles of incorporation to keep the conversation alive, so to speak, this whole process could scale up to what we might now recognize as a moving company organization, not just a group of friends helping people move. I know this is tricky stuff, very different from a lot of the conventional wisdom about organizations and communication most people talk about. But this CCO stuff is an important breakthrough that is changing the field of organizational communication, helping us explain key aspects of organizational life that are crucial for understanding the complexities of modern organizing in organizations. Hey, check out the Spotlight on Scholarship section on page 89 for an example of current organizational communication research from a Montreal School CCO approach. You might even recognize the author of the study. Moving on, the second school of CCO thinking we want to examine is the Four Flows approach, developed by scholars from Arizona State University. The Four Flows approach is strongly rooted in structurationist thinking, and the main idea here is that we can understand the communicative constitution of organizations by appreciating the types of interactions that happen during the process of organizing. If Montreal School thinking is more of a micro approach, looking at how interactions scale up to organization, the Four Flows approach is more macro, looking at how fully constituted organizations exhibit certain higher order communication processes. These include membership negotiation, self-structuring, activity coordination, and institutional positioning. First, membership negotiation involves all the communication related to who is in and out of the organization, and maintaining those distinctions. For example, Think of all the communication processes and patterns of interaction that enable someone to become part of CU, either as a student, faculty, staff, or even alumni, and maintain that insider status. Second, self-structuring involves all the communication related to the design and configuration of an organization. This is why angry mobs and mere neighborhoods are not considered organizations. They have no self-structuring, like policies, procedures, employment charts, or mission statements that guide how work is accomplished. Third, activity coordination involves all the interaction necessary to get things done. So all the emails you get from your boss with instructions about your project, all the calendar invites you get for various meetings, all the conversations you have with people about who will cover which aspects of your project, even the details for the upcoming holiday party. All of this is considered activity coordination. Finally, institutional positioning is all the communication involved in how an organization interacts with its external environment, like client relationships, customer service, advertising and public relations, strategic partnerships, and working with government regulators, just to name a few. All of this is how organizations create, maintain, and change their position within a given institutional context. All of these communication flows working together thus constitute an organization. Of course, some things that are not organizations can exhibit some of these communication flows. You and your friends can coordinate your activities for the weekend, but you're not an organization in the proper sense because you don't have other things like self-structuring or institutional positioning. It also should be noted that these communication flows do not necessarily have to be successful or effective to constitute an organization. Your project planning could be chaotic, or your advertising campaign could be a flop. But instead, it's the engagement in these four flows of communication, regardless of success, that constitutes an organization versus other social collectives. So that's it for Chapter 5 and our look at constitutive approaches to organizational communication. Remember to check out the questions at the end of the chapter to help you review and to inform your discussion board contributions this week. Next up in Chapter 6, we'll cover our final set of approaches to organizational communication, critical and feminist approaches.